The carriage wheels crunched against the gravel as stepped down before the towering estate that would now be her home, its vast stone walls casting long shadows that seemed to swallow her whole. At 22, she had known this day would come, yet nothing had prepared her for the suffocating weight of it. The marriage had been arranged swiftly, negotiated between families with careful politeness and hidden urgency, leaving her little time to understand the man she was to wed. She had heard whispers, of course everyone had. The Duke was powerful, distant, and utterly unyielding, a man whose presence alone could silence a room. Inside, the halls stretched endlessly, adorned with cold marble and muted tapestries that reflected neither warmth nor welcome. Servants lined the corridor, bowing with precise courtesy, their expressions neutral as though trained never to reveal a thought, offered them a small, nervous smile, but it seemed to vanish before it could land. She folded her hands neatly before her, reminding herself to stand straight, to move with grace, to appear worthy of the title she had just acquired. The ceremony itself had been brief, almost perfunctory. Duke Alaric stood beside her, tall and immovable, his gaze fixed forward as though the vows were a mere formality he wished to conclude. His voice, when he spoke, was calm and controlled, devoid of emotion. When repeated her lines, her voice trembled only slightly, though her heart pounded so loudly she feared it might echo through the chamber. When it was over, he did not look at her, not even once, and the absence of that simple acknowledgment settled heavily in her chest. By the time evening arrived, the estate had grown quieter, as though holding its breath, was escorted to a grand chamber that would serve as her room, its high windows framing a darkening sky. She lingered near the doorway for a moment after the servants departed, unsure of what to do with the silence that followed. This was her home now, yet it felt foreign, distant, as though she were merely passing through someone else's life. The door opened without warning. Duke Alaric entered with measured steps, his presence instantly altering the air in the room. Straightened, her fingers tightening slightly around the fabric of her dress. This was the first time they were truly alone, and she felt an unfamiliar tension coil within her. He regarded her briefly, his sharp eyes assessing without warmth. Up close, he was even more imposing, his expression carved from restraint, his posture rigid with control. There was no hostility in his gaze, but there was no kindness either, only a quiet indifference that felt colder than anger. "I will speak plainly," he said, his voice low and even, as though delivering a simple fact. "This marriage exists for necessity, nothing more." Swallowed, nodding slightly, though her throat felt tight. She had expected distance, perhaps even disinterest, but the bluntness of his tone unsettled her. He continued without pause, "You are too plain to be loved as a wife." The words fell between them with a finality that left no room for misunderstanding. For a brief moment, the world seemed to still, the weight of his judgment pressing against her chest. She had been called many things in her life, quiet, unremarkable, forgettable, but never had the truth been spoken with such precision, such cold certainty. Lowered her gaze, her lashes hiding the flicker of hurt that threatened to surface. She could feel it rising, sharp and sudden, but she forced it down, steadying herself with a quiet breath. There would be no tears, not here, not in front of him. "I understand," she replied softly, her voice steady despite the ache beneath it. If he was surprised by her composure, he did not show it. He simply inclined his head slightly, as though acknowledging the completion of a necessary exchange. "You will be provided for. You will fulfill your duties as Duchess. Beyond that, I expect nothing." There was a pause, brief and hollow, waited, uncertain if there was more to be said, but the Duke had already turned away. Without another glance, he moved toward the door, his footsteps quiet against the polished floor. "Good night," he said, though the words carried no warmth. And then he was gone. The silence he left behind felt heavier than before, stood motionless for a long moment, her hands slowly unclenching at her sides. The room seemed larger now, emptier, as though his presence had drawn all the air with it when he departed. She moved to the window, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. For a moment she studied herself, the soft lines of her face, the simplicity of her features, the very qualities that had just been dismissed so easily. She had never thought herself remarkable, but neither had she considered herself lacking. Yet now, under the weight of his words, she felt smaller, diminished in a way she could not fully articulate. Still, as the moments passed, something within her began to settle. The pain did not vanish, but it shifted, becoming quieter, more contained. She had been given clarity, if nothing else. There would be no illusions here, no false hopes to cling to. Whatever this marriage was, it would not be built on affection. In the days that followed, adjusted to the rhythms of the estate with quiet diligence. She rose early, learned the structure of the household, and observed the intricate balance that kept everything running smoothly. The servants were efficient, though distant, mirroring the tone set by their master. Conversations were brief, interactions formal, and the Duke himself remained largely absent, a appearing only when necessary and never lingering longer than required. At first made small efforts to bridge the gap. She ensured his meals were prepared to perfection, left polite notes regarding household matters, and maintained an attentive presence whenever he was near. Each attempt was met with the same polite indifference, acknowledged but never encouraged. It was not rejection in the overt sense, but something quieter, more persistent, a constant reminder that her presence held little significance. Gradually, she began to understand the futility of it. No matter how carefully she performed her role, no matter how much effort she invested, it would not change the foundation upon which their relationship was built. He had already decided what she was, and he saw no reason to reconsider. One evening, as she stood alone in the vast dining hall, the realization settled fully within her. The candles flickered softly, their light casting gentle shadows across the empty seats, and for the first time since her arrival, she allowed herself to stop trying. It was not a dramatic decision, nor was it born of bitterness. It came quietly, like the turning of a page. She would fulfill her duties as expected. She would maintain the dignity of her position, but she would no longer seek what had been from the beginning. As extinguished the final candle and stepped into the dim corridor beyond, her expression remained calm, composed, yet something subtle had changed. The longing that had once lingered in her gaze had faded, replaced by a quiet resolve. And though the Duke did not yet notice, the absence of her silent reaching would soon become far more significant than he ever anticipated. The change-in did not arrive with spectacle, nor did it demand acknowledgement. It unfolded quietly, like dawn easing into a darkened sky. In the weeks following her silent decision, she moved through the estate with the same grace as before, yet without the faint, hopeful hesitation that had once accompanied her every action. She no longer lingered outside the Duke's study, no longer searched his expression for signs of approval, and no longer measured her worth by the absence of his attention. Instead, she turned her focus inward, toward the responsibilities she could shape and the life she could claim within the boundaries given to her. Each morning she reviewed the household accounts with careful precision, noticing inefficiencies that had gone unaddressed for years. She spoke with the head servants not as someone seeking validation, but as a woman intent on understanding the estate's needs. At first, they responded with polite formality, uncertain of her intentions, but her consistency gradually softened their reserve. When she made adjustments, they were thoughtful rather than abrupt, designed to support rather than disrupt. Slowly, the household began to run with a smoother rhythm, one that reflected her quiet diligence. Beyond the walls of the estate, extended her attention to the surrounding lands. She visited the nearby village under the pretense of familiarizing herself with her duties, but her interest soon grew genuine. She listened more than she spoke, absorbing the concerns of the people who lived under the Duke's protection. Where she could offer assistance, she did so without fanfare, ensuring resources were distributed fairly and disputes were settled with fairness. Her presence became a steady reassurance rather than a distant obligation. Word of her actions spread gradually, carried not by proclamation but by quiet gratitude. The servants began to speak of her with respect, their tone shifting from detached courtesy to genuine regard. The villagers, too, regarded her with a warmth that felt unfamiliar yet sincere, accepted it without pride, treating it simply as part of her role. But within her, something began to take root, a sense of capability that did not depend on recognition. Within the estate, her demeanor evolved in ways that were subtle yet unmistakable. She no longer second-guessed her decisions or softened her voice out of uncertainty. When she spoke, it was with calm assurance, her words measured and clear. There was no arrogance in her bearing, only a quiet confidence that seemed to settle naturally into her movements. She carried herself not as someone striving to be seen, but as someone who no longer feared being overlooked. It was this shift, more than any single action, that first drew the Duke's attention. Duke Alaric noticed the changes not all at once, but in fragments that gradually formed a pattern he could not ignore. Reports from the estate became more efficient, requiring less intervention from him. Complaints from the village diminished, replaced by steady accounts of stability. The servants performed their duties with a cohesion that suggested careful oversight. At first, he assumed these improvements were the result of routine correction, but as time passed, the consistency of it began to unsettle him. He observed her during meals, noting the absence of the tentative glances she had once directed toward him. She spoke only when necessary, her tone respectful yet devoid of the quiet eagerness that had once lingered beneath her words. When their gazes met, she did not look away immediately, nor did she linger. She simply acknowledged him with composed neutrality before returning to her thoughts. It irritated him in a way he could not easily define. One afternoon, he encountered her in the courtyard, speaking with a group of servants regarding the upcoming harvest. Her posture was relaxed yet attentive, her voice steady as she outlined adjustments that would ease their workload without compromising efficiency. The servants listened closely, their responses marked by trust rather than obligation. Alaric remained at a distance, unnoticed, as he watched the exchange unfold. There was nothing extraordinary in her appearance. She wore a simple dress, her hair arranged without embellishment, her expression calm. And yet there was a presence about her that had not been there before, a quiet authority that did not demand attention, yet held it nonetheless. For a brief moment, he found himself studying her with an unfamiliar focus, as though trying to reconcile this woman with the impression he had formed upon their marriage. When the conversation ended, she turned and noticed him. There was a pause, brief but perceptible, before she inclined her head in greeting. "Your Grace," she said, her tone even. Alaric regarded her, searching for something he could not name. The estate appears to be functioning efficiently. "I am glad it meets your expectations," she replied. There was no hint of pride in her voice, no attempt to draw further acknowledgement. It was a simple statement, delivered without anticipation. For reasons he could not fully understand, the absence of expectation unsettled him more than any display of ambition would have. "You have made changes," he observed. "Only where necessary," she answered. The foundation was already strong. Her response was measured, neither dismissive nor self-congratulatory, and it left him with little to challenge. He studied her for a moment longer, noting the steadiness in her gaze, the absence of the quiet vulnerability he had once dismissed so easily. "You seem different," he said, the words leaving him before he could reconsider them. Held his gaze without hesitation. "I have simply adjusted to my role." There was nothing defensive in her tone, nothing that invited further inquiry. It was an answer that closed the subject as gently as it had been opened. Alaric found himself at a loss, an unfamiliar sensation that lingered uncomfortably in his chest. For the first time, he became aware of a subtle shift in their dynamic, one that placed him, unexpectedly, at a distance. In the days that followed, his attention returned to her more often than he intended. He noticed the way others responded to her presence, the ease with which she navigated situations that required both tact and decisiveness. He began to recognize patterns in her actions, an underlying consistency that spoke of deliberate thought rather than passive acceptance. And with that recognition came a question he could not easily dismiss. Had he been wrong? The thought lingered longer than it should have, unsettling the certainty he had once held without question. He had judged her quickly, defined her within the confines of his own expectations, and dismissed her without further consideration. At the time, it had seemed justified, even inevitable. Now, faced with the evidence of her quiet competence, that certainty began to erode. It was not a comfortable realization. One evening, as he stood in his study reviewing reports, he found his thoughts drifting once more. The efficiency of the estate, the stability of the lands, the subtle shift in atmosphere, all of it pointed back to her, not in a way that demanded recognition, but in a way that could not be ignored. He set the documents aside, his expression tightening slightly as he considered the implications. There was no dramatic revelation, no sudden change of heart, but there was a fracture in his perception, a small but undeniable crack in the foundation of his earlier judgment. And though he did not yet understand the significance of it, that fracture marked the beginning of something far more difficult to control than indifference. The shift within Duke Alaric did not manifest as warmth, nor did it soften his outward demeanor, yet it altered the way he observed the world around him, particularly where was concerned. What had once been effortless indifference became a quiet, persistent awareness, as though her presence had woven itself into the fabric of his attention without permission. He did not seek her out intentionally, yet he found himself noticing her absence in rooms she once occupied, recognizing the subtle efficiency she left behind in her wake. This awareness sharpened on the day unrest reached the estate. It began as murmurs among the servants, carried in hushed tones that lingered too long to be dismissed. A dispute had arisen in the village, not merely a disagreement between neighbors, but a growing tension over dwindling resources after an unexpectedly poor harvest. Supplies had been mismanaged in previous seasons, leaving reserves strained, and frustration had begun to fester into something more volatile. By the time word reached the estate formally, the situation had already escalated beyond simple mediation. Alaric received the report in his study, his expression tightening as he read the details. Disorder within his lands was not something he tolerated, and his first instinct was swift, decisive intervention. Authority, firmly applied, would restore balance. It always had. Yet before he could issue his orders, another detail caught his attention. Had already gone to the village. For a moment he stared at the report, uncertain whether he had read it correctly. There was no mention of hesitation, no indication that she had sought permission. She had simply acted. A flicker of irritation rose, sharp and immediate. It was not her place to involve herself in matters that could escalate beyond control. The villagers, already agitated, might not respond predictably, and her presence could complicate a situation that required authority, not diplomacy. Without delay, he left the estate. The journey to the village was brief, yet the tension in the air grew palpable as he approached. Voices carried across the open space, raised in frustration, edged with desperation. When he arrived, he expected to find chaos, to see the conflict in full force. Instead, he found order struggling to hold. Stood at the center of the gathering, her posture steady, her expression composed despite the unrest surrounding her. The villagers spoke over one another, their grievances overlapping in a cacophony of discontent, yet she did not raise her voice to match theirs. She listened, her attention unwavering, allowing each concern to surface without interruption. Alaric remained at the edge of the crowd, unseen for the moment, his gaze fixed on her. There was no fear in her demeanor, no visible uncertainty. She moved through the tension with a quiet confidence that seemed to temper the agitation around her. When she spoke, her voice was calm but firm, carrying just enough authority to be heard without force. "We cannot resolve this if we refuse to understand one another," she said, her tone steady. "If supplies are limited, then we must ensure they are distributed fairly. No one will be left without support, but cooperation is necessary." Her words did not silence the crowd entirely, but they shifted something within it. The sharpness of the anger dulled, replaced by reluctant attention. One by one, the villagers began to listen rather than shout, their focus drawn to the clarity of her reasoning. Alaric watched as she worked through the conflict, addressing concerns with measured responses, proposing solutions that balanced fairness with practicality. She did not impose authority, yet she commanded respect through consistency and composure. Even those who remained dissatisfied could not dismiss her outright, and gradually the tension began to ease. It was not a perfect resolution, nor was it immediate, but it was progress. For the first time, Alaric saw her without the filter of his earlier judgment. She was not remarkable in the way society often defined it. She did not dazzle with beauty or overwhelm with presence, yet there was something undeniably compelling in the way she held herself, in the quiet strength that allowed her to stand firm without aggression. It was not something easily dismissed, nor was it something he could reconcile with the word he had once used so carelessly. Plain. The memory of it settled uneasily in his mind. When the gathering finally dispersed, the villagers returning to their homes with a semblance of order restored, allowed herself a brief moment of stillness. The tension that had surrounded her faded, leaving behind a quiet exhaustion she did not immediately reveal. It was then that she noticed him. For a fraction of a second, something flickered in her expression, surprise, perhaps, or the awareness of his presence, but it was gone almost as quickly as it appeared. She inclined her head in greeting, her composure returning seamlessly. "Your Grace," she said. Alaric stepped forward, his gaze steady as he regarded her. "You acted without informing me." There was no overt reprimand in his tone, yet the weight of the statement lingered. "The situation required immediate attention," she replied. "Delaying would have allowed it to worsen." Her response was neither defensive nor apologetic, simply a statement of fact. It left little room for argument, yet it did not challenge his authority outright. He studied her, searching for any sign of doubt, any indication that she questioned her decision. There was none. "You placed yourself at risk," he said. "I assessed the risk," she answered calmly, "and I believed it manageable." The certainty in her voice unsettled him more than recklessness would have. It was not blind confidence, but measured judgment, the kind that came from understanding rather than impulse. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, unexpectedly, Alaric said, "You handled it well." The words felt unfamiliar as they left him, as though they belonged to someone else. He was not a man who offered praise lightly, nor without reason, yet in that moment there was no denying the truth of it. Regarded him quietly, her expression unreadable. "Thank you." There was no visible reaction beyond the acknowledgement, no hint that his approval carried the weight it once might have. It was accepted, then set aside, as though it held no greater significance than any other observation. and for reasons he could not fully understand, that unsettled him more than rejection ever could. As they returned to the estate, the silence between them was not strained, yet it was far from comfortable. Alaric found his thoughts returning to the scene he had witnessed, replaying it with a clarity that refused to fade. The image of her standing amidst the unrest, unwavering, resolute, did not align with the version of her he had constructed in his mind. It contradicted it entirely. By the time they reached the estate, the realization had taken root, difficult to ignore and impossible to dismiss. He had been wrong. The certainty of it settled heavily within him, not as a fleeting thought but as an undeniable truth, and with that truth came something far more troubling than doubt. Regret. It lingered beneath the surface, quiet but persistent, growing stronger with each passing moment. He had judged her without understanding, dismissed her without consideration, and in doing so, he had overlooked something far more significant than he had ever anticipated. As he watched her walk ahead of him, her steps steady, her posture composed, he became aware of a shift he could not reverse. The distance between them, once created by his indifference, now felt like something he did not know how to cross. Regret did not grant Duke Alaric the clarity he expected. Instead, it unsettled him with a persistence that refused to fade. It followed him through the halls of the estate, lingered in the silence of his study, and surfaced in every quiet moment when his thoughts were left unguarded. The certainty that had once defined his judgment was gone, replaced by an awareness that he had misjudged not only, but the very nature of what he had dismissed. What troubled him most was not simply the mistake, but the realization that its consequences could not be undone with the same ease with which it had been made. For her part continued as she always had, though the quiet transformation within her had settled into something steady and unshakable. She fulfilled her responsibilities with calm precision, her presence bringing order without demand. If she noticed the subtle shift in the Duke's attention, she gave no indication. Her interactions with him remained respectful, composed, and distant in a way that reflected neither resentment nor expectation. She had accepted the shape of her life as it stood, and she no longer reached beyond it. It was this absence of reaching that pressed most heavily against Alaric's thoughts. He began with small changes, subtle adjustments in his behavior that he told himself were reasonable, even necessary. He listened more closely when she spoke, considered her decisions without immediate dismissal, and ensured that her efforts were acknowledged where they had once been overlooked. These actions, though unfamiliar, felt like the only logical response to the truth he had come to recognize. Yet each attempt, however measured, seemed to fall into a quiet void, received without resistance but also without any visible shift in her demeanor. One evening, as they shared the dining hall in near silence, Alaric set aside his glass and regarded her with a focus that no longer allowed for hesitation. The distance between them had been defined by his indifference once. Now it persisted despite his awareness, and that, more than anything, compelled him to act. "You have done much for this estate," he said, his voice steady, though the words carried an unfamiliar weight. "Its stability is due in no small part to your efforts." Looked up briefly, meeting his gaze with calm neutrality. "It is my responsibility." Her response was neither dismissive nor inviting, simply factual. It acknowledged his statement without attaching significance to it. Alaric felt the faintest tightening in his chest, an unaccustomed reaction that he could not easily ignore. "It is more than that," he said, more firmly than before. "You have exceeded what was expected." A brief pause followed, subtle yet perceptible, inclined her head slightly. "Then I am glad it has proven beneficial." Again, the same measured acceptance, the same absence of engagement beyond what was necessary. It was not coldness, nor was it indifference in the way he had once displayed, but it created a barrier just as impenetrable. Alaric understood then that acknowledgement alone would not bridge the distance he had created. In the days that followed, he altered his approach. His actions became more deliberate, less restrained by the rigid boundaries he had once imposed upon himself. He sought her presence under the pretense of discussing estate matters, though the conversations often extended beyond their initial purpose. He asked for her perspective, not as a formality, but with genuine interest, and he listened to her responses with an attention that left no doubt as to his intent. Responded as she always did, calm, thoughtful, composed. She engaged where necessary, offered insight when asked, and maintained a steady professionalism that revealed nothing of what lay beneath. If she noticed the shift in his behavior, she did not comment on it, nor did she allow it to alter the boundaries she had quietly established. The realization that she would not meet him halfway without cause settled heavily within him. It was not resistance he faced, nor rejection, but something far more difficult to overcome, a quiet independence that no longer required his presence to feel complete. She had built a life within the confines of their marriage that did not depend on his affection, and in doing so, she had removed the very foundation upon which he might have easily regained her favor. For the first time, Alaric understood the full weight of what he had lost. The moment he chose to speak openly came without ceremony, driven not by strategy, but by the simple recognition that silence would change nothing. He found her in the garden as dusk settled over the estate, the fading light casting soft shadows across the path where she stood. He said, his voice carrying a steadiness that belied the tension beneath it. She turned to face him, her expression composed, her posture relaxed yet attentive. "Your Grace." He paused, the formal address striking him with an unexpected force. It was correct, appropriate, and entirely devoid of the familiarity he now found himself wanting. "I was wrong," he said. The words were direct, unembellished, and for a moment they seemed to settle into the space between them without immediate response. Regarded him quietly, her gaze steady, as though weighing not the words themselves, but the sincerity behind them. "I judged you without understanding," he continued. "I dismissed what I did not take the time to see. That was my failure, not yours." There was no attempt to soften the admission, no effort to justify it. It was stated plainly, with the same clarity he had once used to diminish her, yet now that clarity carried something entirely different. Remained silent for a moment longer before speaking. "You have acknowledged it." Her tone was calm, neither accepting nor rejecting, simply recognizing the statement as it was. Alaric took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. "That is not enough." The quiet certainty in his voice marked a shift that could not be mistaken. "I do not expect forgiveness simply because I have spoken the truth, but I will not remain as I was. I will not continue to treat you as though you are insignificant." Something in her expression shifted then, subtle but undeniable. It was not a softening, nor was it resistance, but a moment of consideration that had not been present before. "You have changed your actions," she said. "That is evident." "It is not change enough," he replied. "Not yet." The honesty of the statement lingered between them, unguarded and unforced. Studied him for a moment, her gaze searching, not for weakness, but for consistency. "Then you understand that words alone will not alter what has already been established." "I do," he said. The simplicity of his response carried more weight than any elaborate promise could have. The silence that followed was not empty, but measured, as though both of them recognized that something had shifted, even if its direction remained uncertain. Finally spoke, her voice steady. "Then we will see what time reveals." It was neither acceptance nor refusal, but something far more meaningful, a decision to allow the possibility of change without surrendering the strength she had built. Alaric inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the terms without resistance. For the first time, he understood that this was not a matter of reclaiming what he had lost, but of earning something entirely new. As the last light of day faded into evening, they stood in quiet understanding, no longer bound solely by obligation, but by the uncertain promise of what might yet be built. And though the path ahead remained undefined, it was, at last, a path they would walk with awareness rather than assumption.